Day 931 now of the Trump administration. It brings a new development tonight in the president's attempts to overhaul the leadership of the nation's 17 intelligence agencies. Goes without saying, this comes at a critical time this week when domestic terrorism is top of mind. Tonight, Trump confirmed that Sue Gordon, the career professional deputy to the outgoing DNI, Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats, is stepping down. She was next in line to replace Coats tonight, and somewhat tellingly, she released a handwritten letter on top of her official letter of resignation. It was a letter to the president, and it reads, quote, "Mr. President, I offer this letter as an act of respect and patriotism, not preference. You should have your team. Godspeed, Sue." Now, both Gordon and her boss are leaving August 15th, a week from today, and they take their institutional history with them, of course. Trump also used social media tonight to announce that the new acting DNI will be Admiral Joseph McGuire. He's the current director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Outgoing DNI Dan Coats often clashed with Trump over intelligence assessments. His announced resignation came late last month. And there had been reports that Trump wanted to block Gordon from taking over as acting director once Coats left. Tonight, the chairman of the Senate Intel Committee, North Carolina Republican Richard Burr, issued a statement calling Sue Gordon's departure, quote, a significant loss for the intelligence community. The statement from Burr's vice chairman, the Democrat Mark Warner of Virginia, was much more pointed, quote, President Trump has repeatedly demonstrated that he is seemingly incapable of hearing facts that contradict his own views. The mission of the intelligence community is to speak truth to power, yet in pushing out two dedicated public servants in as many weeks, once again, the president has shown that he has no problem prioritizing his political ego, even if it comes at the expense of our national security. Warner's words speak to a concern among some of his colleagues in Congress from both parties. Two new lawsuits from former members of the intelligence community also echo those fears. Ousted FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, who was the one who authorized an investigation into the president over ties to Russia, today revealed he is suing the Department of Justice. The language suggests he was fired, quote, for his refusal to pledge partisan allegiance to Trump. And Peter Strzok, the FBI senior counterintelligence agent in the Hillary Clinton email matter and the Russia investigations, is also suing DOJ and the FBI for good measure. He is citing political pressure from Trump and his allies in Congress and the media. And there's this from House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler, Democrat of New York. He said tonight in more than one television appearance, in so many words, this is happening. His committee is already conducting formal impeachment proceedings.
Political considerations aside, we must protect the Constitution. This is probably one of the worst crises we've faced in constitutional law since after the Civil War. In terms of aggrandizement of power to the executive, in terms of denial of congressional power, separation of powers, in terms of the president asserting powers that he doesn't have and using them. We have to have limited government. We have to have constitutional government, and only Congress can do this.
Nadler says the decision will be made by the end of the year on whether actual articles of impeachment should be referred to the full House of Representatives. So a lot to get through. We initially want to start here with a telephone call with the former CIA Director John Brennan, who happens to be our senior national security and intelligence analyst. Director Brennan, I wanted to get your initial reaction, the departure of Sue Gordon. What is lost in this, especially as it is paired with the departure of DNI Coats?
Well, good evening, Brian. And as you mentioned, Sue Gordon is an exceptionally experienced intelligence professional, over 30 years experience working at the CIA, and then as Dan Coats' principal deputy. I was very disappointed to hear that Sue will be leaving on the same day as Dan Coats. When you lose the DNI and the principal deputy DNI at the same time, you're basically decapitating the intelligence community. And that DNI role is important given the size of the intelligence community and the need for this orchestration to take place in an effective as well as a professional manner. And the named acting director, Joe McGuire, I know him and I respect him. He was the head. Is the head right now of the National Counterterrorism Center, but he certainly does not have the breadth of experience and the depth of experience that Sue Gordon has. So I think it is very discouraging to a lot of individuals right now in the intelligence community that Sue Gordon will not be serving in that acting capacity at a very challenging time of our national security.
Speaking of the times we're living in, I guess you have to live with the notion that a lot of people will always believe that it was a tweet from Don Trump Jr. that alleged you were best friends with Sue Gordon that some will always believe was a major force in disqualifying her in the president's eyes to take the top job.
Well, I don't take anything that Don Jr. says seriously. I knew Sue Gordon, worked very closely with her. She worked with thousands of intelligence professionals throughout the course of her career. She has the utmost respect and admiration of those individuals that she worked for. And if her time working with me at the CIA was disqualifying for this position, well, that's probably disqualifying of thousands of dedicated women and men at the CIA and throughout the intelligence community that I've worked with over the years. And so I think this just reflects an interest on the part of the Trump administration to have an individual that's going to show personal loyalty to Donald Trump as opposed to dedication to the mission, loyalty to the Constitution and the country. And Sue Gordon was that type of person who speaks the proverbial truth to power. And I am sad to see her go, but I do believe that the women and men of the intelligence community will continue to do their level best, irrespective of the lack of attention that Donald Trump is giving to their work. They know that what they do every day around the globe is critically important to their fellow citizens, and I have every confidence that they will continue along those lines.
Former CIA Director John Brennan, thanks for being available to us by telephone tonight. We appreciate it. And with us to start off our discussion on a Thursday evening, Robert Costa, national political reporter for The Washington Post, moderator of Washington Week on PBS, Anita Kumar, White House correspondent and associate editor for Politico, and Jeremy Bash is able to join us tonight, former chief of staff at the CIA and the Pentagon. And Jeremy, I want to begin with you by dint of your knowledge of Sue Gordon, her work, and knowing her over so many years.
Everybody in the intelligence community respects Sue, and they wanted her to lead the community. She not only was a career CIA officer, she also was deputy director of one of the premier intelligence agencies, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and she's most recently been serving as the #2 leader of all 17 intelligence components. She has energy, she has wisdom, she has judgment, and I think fundamentally, Brian, to understand what happened to Sue is to understand what Donald Trump has done to the intelligence community writ large. He started his presidency by standing in front of the CIA officers' memorial wall and talking about how many times he had been on the cover of Time magazine. He then compared intelligence community professionals to Nazis. He then took the word of Vladimir Putin over the CIA in its assessment of what happened in 2016. And so this was just the latest insult, the latest effort to undermine, the latest effort to ignore the judgment of intelligence professionals.
What is your knowledge of the new acting guy, the Admiral McGuire?
He's solid. He had a stellar career in the Navy. He commanded at many levels. I think John Brennan's assessment is right, though. I think what's happened is that the president wants someone who's a caretaker until he can nominate his own political ally as DNI. Sue Gordon was not going to be anybody's political ally, and that's fundamentally why she was asked to leave.
Robert Costa, what light can you shed on this decision process, how this went down?
Inside the White House, the president was looking for an ally weeks ago. That's why he nominated John Ratcliffe, the congressman, to be his nominee for DNI. But after those resume problems, pulled the nomination. And so you now have a president searching around, but reluctant to engage with the intelligence community. He's being told by many of his allies daily that he was burned in their eyes by the Mueller report and by the intel community. You saw the president's own son, Donald Trump Jr., tweet about Ms. Gordon and her association professionally with Mr. Brennan. And so you have a group of people inside and outside this White House who are saying to the president, push for somebody on your side, People close to the president tonight are saying maybe Pete Hoekstra, the former Intelligence Committee chairman, a Republican from Michigan, now an ambassador in the Trump administration, could be the nominee. Someone like what the president sought in John Ratcliffe.
Well, that's an interesting name in the hopper. And Anita, this gets us to your beat at the White House. This is yet another acting position for this administration.
Right. It definitely is. The president has, as you know, there has been so many acting. There are currently so many acting. And as we enter sort of this second part of his term, he is looking to keep a lot of these actings there. One of the reasons is because he likes that these people are temporary. He feels that he has more control over them. They, don't know whether they're going to be around long or not. And so he can kind of have more control over the agencies and the departments. And so we've seen that over and over. And it, sometimes he quickly announces someone and sometimes he doesn't.
And Robert Costa, back to the Republicans. Will there be protests that they are losing, again, the institutional memory of a multi-decade career professional in Sue Gordon? That's regardless of how much support she could have had within the organization writ large to be the next DNI.
All eyes tonight on Chairman Burr and on the Senate Intelligence Committee. He and Chairman Schiff in the House, a Democrat, were encouraging the White House to stick with Miss Gordon. She was a reliable set of hands to help guide this administration and this president. Chairman Burr issued a statement tonight saying he's supportive of Admiral McGuire, but he is keeping watch. Will this be politicized? Will Admiral McGuire or whomever the president chooses to be his nominee for DNI, will it be someone who's perceived as a political pick? And at this charged moment, Senate Republicans, including Mr. Burr, I'm told by people close to him, are very uneasy about these dynamics. They think the president could move in a more political direction and put the entire intelligence community really in an isolated position away from the executive.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.